this is a Trans 101 workshop, and my name is Robyn Henderson-Espinoza. And if you're wondering about gender pronouns, because we're going to talk a little bit about that, please use my name, Robyn, or if that's too difficult for you, you can use they, them, or their. Okay? So, by way of introduction and agenda, let me just tell you a little bit about myself. I am currently finishing a PhD at the University of Denver. My field of study is ethics and queer theory, and I do a wide variety of things, anything from the materiality of the body to gender performance issues. And I've been trained as a theologian ethicist in 3 religiously affiliated institutions. I went to seminary at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary. My degree there is in theological ethics. So I can talk anything around the sort of theology of gender, theology of sexuality, to the ethics of gender, ethics of sexuality, and everything in between. Our agenda today is going to be sort of introducing trans issues. And I really want this to be more of a conversation, not strictly didactic. So I hope that you will learn some things and that maybe there is a creative opening for me to teach you some things. But really, I'm much more of a conversational facilitator, if you will. And so we will leave spaces for you to ask questions. And, you know, I hope you have brought some questions to the space. Let me ask you this one question as a way of a jumping off point. Is this term trans or transgender, is that new for anyone? And no one raised their hand. That's amazing. I've never been in a LGBT space where trans is not new. It for someone, I always have new people when we're doing this. So this is great. So maybe we're all veterans around trans issues, but maybe not. Let's get started.
One thing I would like to say is that I understand what, the trans and transgender, but what I really need to learn more of is when people are asking me questions about what it is, I want to be able to have a good insight on, what it means and what it, involves, because that's the things that I don't totally understand.
Great.
And I would like to understand better.
That's great. And let me also say that we only have an hour and 15 minutes to become experts in Trans 101. and if there are lingering questions, I'm going to be here through dinner and the worship service. So, maybe we can find time during dinner to talk about questions that aren't answered. Maybe we can find time after the worship service, whatnot. So or we can be in conversation via email. I'd be happy to give you my email address. So this is a great question. How do we respond to these questions about what is trans or what is transgender? That's a great question. But let's first talk about creating a covenant together, being in conversation with one another, right? We live in a society where trust and intimacy is oftentimes taken for granted. But together, I want to try to create a conversational covenant. And so we want to talk about how we honor one another. We may have diverse opinions here. We may disagree with one another. But we want to honor all persons. And we want to honor labels over definitions. We might not all use the right label or the right definition, right? But we want to honor people and our own stories over definitions and labels. The other thing is whatever personal stories we bring to the table today, we want to honor those. They may be differing stories. We may not agree with the stories. We may not agree with how people live out their gender or sexual identity orientation, but we want to honor these stories. And another point here is that none of us are on display. This is not a fashion show or any sort of personality cult. No one is on display. So we honor our stories, we honor the way we bring ourselves to the table, and we respect our neighbors and our friends. We welcome courage and vulnerability. I think anytime when we talk about sexual orientation, gender identity, there's always a risk that we take. And in that risk, we want to honor people and respect courage and vulnerability. So there may be some time when someone shares a story that feels kind of touchy, right? We want to respect their courage in speaking up and having a voice in the space. So, Trans 101. I want to talk a little bit about this thing called the binary. We live in a society of black and white, male, female, woman, man. And when a baby is born, this is the first question that is asked. Is it a boy or girl? And on a birth certificate, they have to mark male or female. But isn't there more than that? I want to suggest there is. And I want to suggest that we open our minds to the possibility of more than male and female. More than black and white. So defining trans. This may get to your question. What do we mean by this? How do we respond to people? And I want to open this up for folks to kind of, since no one raised their hand that this was a new term, what might we mean by trans or transgender? I want to open the floor up. What do we think that means?
Someone in gender transition?
Okay, gender transition. Anybody else?
I don't see it so much as a transition, more as someone who is not, doesn't, okay, so their gender identity isn't the sex that they were assigned at birth.
Okay.
Like, that's not what they define themselves.
Okay. Okay. So maybe not identifying with or not aligning with a sex or a gender that was assigned to them at birth.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Anybody else?
I usually think that, or suspect that there's not a place of anchorage in masculinity, femininity, that it's far more fluid.
Okay.
That is a little different than the gender identity, but that there isn't the script that we may be more familiar with in terms of who does what by gender, and that there is a fluidity that a person has that I may need to learn about.
Is this new gender fluidity? Is that new for folks, or are people pretty familiar with that type of thinking?
New for me.
New. So let's just take a moment and talk about what this might mean. I think that for a lot of us, we can say that we were taught to be anchored in a sexual orientation and gender identity. Would you say that that's true? Or were you given options growing up? I mean, some of us weren't given options. I mean, I remember, for as long as I can remember, I have been gender nonconforming. And I have not identified as male or female. And I think that for many years, my white father, so my mom is from Mexico, and my Mexican mother was very okay with this, but my white father, not so much. So there was this tension in my own life in trying to live out this gender fluidity, right? So for many of us probably, we were not given options on living out our sexual orientation or gender identity, not given the option of fluidity, but rather only talking about the sort of staple identity and gender performance that is either male or female, right? It goes back to the first slide. What is it? Is it a boy or a girl? Is it M or is it F? Right? This is how our society has structured gender. That there are no options. That if you have a vagina, you are a girl and female and feminine. And if you have a penis, you are male, masculine, and a man. Would you say that is true for your own experience as you've navigated society and church? I'm curious, what about you?
I mean, yeah, the notion that there are options is unfortunately not one that ever comes up. And I know in some super broad sense, I kind of like a definition of trans that includes everybody who, not only have you never had an argument with whatever your birth certificate is labeled, but even if sometimes the expectations that go with it have itched, and people say, well, if you define it that way, it includes almost everybody. And I say, yeah, exactly. All those, there's a lot of expectations that go with whatever you were told you were at the beginning. And if none of them ever bothered you, maybe you just forgot the point where it bothered you. I'm not sure.
I mean, so we can even talk about, if you're born with a vagina, then that necessarily means that you're going to wear a dress and marry someone with a penis, for example, right? This is the not given any options, you're socialized into a certain type of gender identity and sexual orientation, right? So I think 20 years ago, transgender was not an umbrella term for everyone, right? That maybe crossed over transcended gender identity. For a lot of people, transgender meant someone who was not identifying or not aligned with their sex at birth, and they were going to transition from one sex and gender to another sex and gender, right? So now we can talk about maybe understanding the asterisk in trans, which gets at what you're talking about. So this is probably a new phenomenon over the past 5-7 years. The asterisk emerged in defining what trans is, and so 20 years ago, trans referred to someone who was doing a sex reassignment or gender reassignment. Now trans might refer to a more broader spectrum of people who are either transcending the gender binary and participating in gender fluidity, or someone who might be taking hormone replacement therapy, someone who is choosing to modify their body in a certain way to look or to live out a certain type of sexual identity and gender identity. And so the asterisk in trans is much more broader than, for example, transgender 20 years ago, right? So why is this important? This is important because I think we're moving more into an area, a gray area when it comes to gender identity and sexual identity. That there is less of an anchoring of gender and sexuality or sexual orientation identity, and more of a participating in the gray space. Now, I don't want to say that there aren't some people who don't cling on to a very sort of stable, static understanding of gender. There are. But there are other folks, myself included, who say, you know what, I want to transcend the gender binary, and I want to be either, this sort of masculine of center person, or genderqueer, androgynous, and not root myself in a stable gender identity. Does that make sense to folks? Is this new information? It's okay if it is, because I want to spend some time unpacking whatever is new before we move on.
Make it sound a little bit like a choice, though. It's a sort of an awareness thing, though, isn't it?
So I think for a lot of people, they would say, yeah, my gender is my choice, and they too come to an awareness of this, I think for some people who aren't given the opportunity to think about options or fluidity, then they don't have the choice. I mean, I think of, for example, my mother-in-law, who's a conservative evangelical, who this is just not even, in her thinking. You're born with a vagina, therefore you marry a man, you cook at home for your man, and her gender identity is not a choice, right? It's this, I think being anchored is a great term, that she's anchored in a certain identity. And so I think for some people it is a choice. For others, I think the idea of choice is not even part of their awareness. Other ideas? You look troubled.
Yeah, I guess I am. I guess my thought is that if you're, this seems like such a hard place to be.
Okay.
In society, it seems like a very hard place to be.
The trans space.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you talk about what you mean by that? It's a hard place to be?
Well, because we are in a society that is so aware of gender being male and female in the general public. I would think it would be very difficult to identify who you wanted to be, or who you were, not who you wanted to be, but who you were in society like this. I mean, if you're in this place where you don't, you're neither male nor you're female, it just seems like such a difficult position to be in such a hard place to be. And I'm not saying that it's not the person's fault, it's who they are, but it seems very hard to be able to function.
So, I think the in-between space is a really rich space to be. And the in-between space is a place where I flourish most. And if you want to tie it to sort of creation, in between being created and not being created is where I most find my peace with God. So what I mean by that is that I am constantly made anew in this in-between space. And the Spirit is forever with me in the in-between space. And so did you remember the scripture, and I grew up Baptist and I should know this scripture, but it's in the New Testament and it's Paul's writing, and Paul's writing says, when I'm unable to speak, the Spirit intercedes on my behalf. That this in-between space, something happens. And for me, as I was growing up, and I discovered this in-between space, granted, I didn't have the language for it till I got into graduate school. But this in-between space is where I best knew myself and was best able to function. And so I think for a lot of people, and I don't think everyone is in the in-between space, but for a lot of people, this being in between is where they're most alive.
That simplifies it a lot, because I think even as a man or a woman, I think we could still be in an in-between place.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Gender's like a spectrum, I think. It's not, it's a spectrum, and you can be anywhere in that spectrum.
Yeah.
Okay,
That's
Yeah.
how I
good
see
to know.
gender.
Yeah. We can talk about a continuum, that gender is a continuum, that gender is a spectrum, sexuality for that matter is a continuum or a spectrum for some people. For some people, sexuality is not a continuum, and that's okay. That's okay. So let's get straight with our terminology, all right? But here are some terms that might be associated, or that oftentimes is associated with transgender communities. So transgender cross-dressers, intersex, I'll talk a little bit about that. F to M or M to F, right? This is a female who transitions to male, or a male who transitions to female. Gender, sex, drag queen, transsexual, sexual orientation, and gender. So these are some of the terms that we're going to be talking about today as we go through. We have about 55 minutes left. So we're gonna get as far as we can and answer as many questions as possible. So some other terms that might be new for you. Genderqueer, transition, stealth, passing, two-spirit, and people of transgender experience. Are any of these terms new for you? I want to talk a little bit about them if they are.
Yeah, I need some education on these.
Okay, all right, let's do it. So genderqueer. Genderqueer refers to a type of gender identity or gender expression that either plays with gender, disrupts stable gender norms, or transgresses gender identities. Does that make sense? I identify as a genderqueer person. I want to transcend and disrupt the gender binary, right? So the sort of either in between space or sort of beyond gender. Does that make sense? Transition. Transition might refer to someone who's taking hormone replacement therapy or having some sort of medical modification, gender transition surgery or gender resignification surgery. I'm sure that we've all heard, there is a famous place in Colorado, in Pueblo, where the first doctor performed gender reassignment surgery on someone. This person just retired. San Francisco is a big place where this happens. And more doctors are becoming comfortable with helping folks transition, if you will. So transition refers to this process of crossing over to other types and experiences of gender. Stealth. Stealth might be a new term for folks. Stealth refers to a transgender person who doesn't talk about their transition or transgender experience. So I recently met someone who has transitioned but doesn't talk about the transition. And this person was an F to M. And I tagged this person on Facebook, right? Because that's what you do. At least that's what I do. I tag people like when I'm hanging out with them. And they wrote to me and he said, I don't talk about my transition. That's a stealth person. Passing. Passing refers to someone who passes in a sort of their assumed gender, right? So I feel like you pass as a woman.
I hate that term.
Right. Right. So the terms are not always comfortable with people.
Right. But, and I only say that because I feel like what other minority feels like a failure? You know, if you notice that someone's Vietnamese, oh no,
Right.
you knew.
Right.
But anyway,
Right.
personal rant. Sorry.
Right. Two-spirit. Two-spirit refers to Native American communities who are born with both male and female spirits, if you will. It's important to bring race into this picture, and we can talk about communities of color and how they deal with transgressing gender as well. Hopefully we'll have time to do that. And people of transgender experiences, this is kind of a newer term that has emerged, which refers to folks in maybe rural areas that have some type of experience with gender transgression or gender resignification. Does that all make sense to folks? Is it clicking? Are there questions?
Say the last one that you just said.
People of transgender experience, this often refers to people in rural communities. We see this term, our scholarship suggests that this term is used in more rural areas rather than urban areas.
Okay, so it's more of a term than a definition?
Yeah, this is, so if I lived in the country somewhere, maybe in rural Indiana or Kentucky, I might use this term to refer to myself.
Okay.
I've met people who would want to say, no, I'm not transsexual. At one point I was. Now I've completed my transition and that's just part of my experience and it's not who I am now. I'm not going to argue with them. I don't know if it is a great attitude, but it's one way some people describe themselves.
Yeah. And also, I should say on the, this was a popular term that was used, 20, 30 years ago. People who were either cross-dressing, taking some type of hormone modification, that they might use this term for themselves. That I want to also say that this is a generational term, and so transgender is in some cases used in preference to transsexual.
And I don't think you should be too nervous about these terms because transgender people argue with each other about the terms a lot. So, yeah.
So sex, gender, and orientation. Because I think anytime we're talking about trans issues, we're already talking about sex, gender, and orientation. So going back to the first slide that I showed you, is it a boy or is it a girl, right? Check one or the other. That if we go down this list, sex, gender, gender expression, sexual orientation, it might fall into this category, right? If you're born female, then it follows suit. Your gender identity is a woman, your gender expression is feminine, your sexual orientation, you're attracted to male and men, right? This is the binary. On the flip side, we might have this. Your sex is male, right? If you're born with a penis, then your sex obviously is male. Your gender identity is man. Your gender expression is masculine. And your sexual orientation is towards female and women. Right? This is the anchoring. This is how society has anchored us all into sort of living out our gender identity and sexual orientation. So then what about pronouns, right? If you have a vagina, then your pronoun is obviously she and her. And if you're male or born with a penis, then obviously it's he or him. But what about these transgender pronouns, queer pronouns as I call them? Z and zir, zis, here, they and them. Right? These are all important in terms of the spectrum of transgender issues. So what do we mean by queer? Because I've used that in a couple different instances. I've used it in terms of gender queer, and as in part of the LGBT queer spectrum and umbrella. And what do we mean by queer? Is this a new term for folks? Are we all pretty familiar with queer? Maybe, maybe not. So what do we mean by queer?
So queer is kind of, on itself, it's an umbrella term for anything that just falls out of heteronormativity.
Okay.
So, and the norm.
Mm-hmm.
So anything that isn't, if you're gender queer, your gender isn't exactly, what people would think is the norm. You want to, if you're thinking about it in a spectrum, you aren't anchored to like female or male. You're
Right.
kind of flowing in between.
Or I might make an assumption about you that you're straight and that you're woman, right? But you might identify otherwise,
Yes.
right? As queer, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a great way to think about queer as sort of against the norm or outside the norm. If you look it up in the dictionary, queer might refer to something as being strange or twisting. I think outside the norm, beyond the norm is a good way to think about queer. There's also a way to think about queer as that it's unstable. And I don't mean that in a clinical term, but I mean that in a sense that if someone is queer, they might not be sort of anchored. This is a great term, anchored. Anchored into one orientation or identity, right? So unstable or not anchored into how society has socialized and normalized us. So queer, I think, is in terms of moving beyond static stasis, moving beyond the norm, is strange, is a type of twisting. I do a lot of work in Latino theology and Latino ethics, and I use the term retorcer, right? The sort of twisting and turning. I think that's queer. So I just want to make sure that we have a definition for queer as we move on. So what about it? Can we move beyond the binary? We live in a world that continually stabilizes the binary. right? We have states who have constitutional amendments that say a marriage is between a man and a woman. And so for some people, moving beyond the binary is not an option. But I want to suggest and advocate that we are able to move beyond the binary, that there are many options for both sexual orientation and gender identity and performance. And is there something beyond male and female? Why not genderqueer and transgender? Right? I want to say that this is a viable option for life today. So if we look at this sex and gender spectrum, this probably looks really familiar to folks, right? On the top you have sex, and on one side you have female, and on the other side you have male, right? This is the binary. But I want to say that this diagram helps represent a spectrum of sort of identity and orientation. And then on the bottom you have gender identity, women or men. So transgender. Transgender pops in here, and I want to argue that it crosses over the binary. It disrupts the binary and creates a type of continuum for sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. You also have intersex, which some people might say is part of the transgender experience and maybe not. If you're interested in intersex work, I can point you to Susanna Cornwall's work. She's a theologian who works at the Lincoln Theological Institute in England. And in gender identity here on the bottom, you have genderqueer, which disrupts the binary. This term cisgender might be new to folks. Cisgender, cis is Latin for same. So same gender, it would fall over here, right? If you're born with a vagina and you identify as a woman and you're feminine, you might call yourself cisgender. Or if you're born with a penis, you identify as male and attracted to people with vaginas, you might call yourself cisgender male. I would say this is not part of the transgender experience, the cisgender. Is that term new for folks?
Yeah.
Okay. We found something that's new. That's great. When it comes to gender expression, again, you have cisgender on the left, right? So if you're female, then and feminine, you might identify as cisgender. If you're somewhere in between, this in between space comes up again, or maybe beyond the cisgender, you might talk about yourself being androgynous. Again, a non-anchoring standpoint when it comes to gender expression. And then when you talk about sexual attraction, we might use the terms queer, bisexual, pansexual, asexual, or polysexual. Are any of those terms new? Pansexual. So pansexual might refer to a person who is attracted to lots of different things. It's a way of talking about sexuality that is destabilized, right? That just because I might have a vagina, then I'm automatically attracted to a person with a penis. It's also a way to talk about desire and sexuality is very complicated, and so I might have attractions to lots of different people, right? So I have a partner of 15 years, but the way I think about desire, like I'm attracted to people who do ethics. So does that make me pansexual? That doesn't mean I may be sexually intimate with them, but I might talk about myself as a person of pansexual experience because I have multiple desires and multiple attractions. That's a way to think about it. That's not how everyone uses it, though. Yes?
Isn't that the same thing as a bisexual?
So, bisexual, I don't know. What do you think?
I think so.
I don't
So-
think so.
So a pansexual and a bisexual might be the same thing, might be parallel.
I think a lot of the difference is that bi implies there's only two possible categories you could be interested in, and a lot of people who consider themselves pansexual want to go back and acknowledge that there's actually more of a spectrum out there and that they may have more than two narrow categories that they could be interested in. So very, very similar, you're right, but kind of with more of an acknowledgement of the way there's spectrums out there, spectra.
I think polysexual and pansexual can oftentimes be categorized together, that there are many options for sexual identity, sexual orientation, and attraction, where bisexual continues to locate us in the binary. That it's an either or, not a both and. And I would say pansexual and polysexual affirms the both and part of sexuality and gender, where bisexual doesn't. Does that make sense to folks? Yes.
I do know somebody who identifies as pansexual, and she put it so simply for me before I even heard this term. She's like, I love everybody. She didn't care. She loved everybody.
And I know that in some communities, people might refer to, and this may be a little risque to say this in a church, but it could refer to things beyond bodies, right? I mean, we have love and desire and attraction for things beyond human bodies, right? I love my animals, for example. That might make me pansexual. Again, it doesn't imply a type of sexual activity, though. I think for some people, that's a different story. But again, just sort of the breadth of desire and attraction, right? Think beyond the norm here. Think beyond the norm. But yes, I love everybody statement is a great way to talk about pansexuality.
I think the thing that if you associate the word sexual with anything, people automatically think that it has to be a sexual relationship.
Right. Do you think that that's problematic?
I think for some people it would be.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. When we're talking about sexuality and gender identity,
Because that's what people focus on.
Right.
Rather than focusing on the person themselves.
Right. So I think we can also talk about sexuality and gender and trans issues as being a relational event. And by that I mean that we are all in relationship with lots of different people and things. And our gender identity and sexual orientation always is a part of that relational event, right? So how I relate with someone with a vagina might be different than the way, for example, you might relate with someone with a vagina, right? So sexuality, gender orientation is always a relational event. What about gender variant? Is this a new term for folks?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think it might mean? Yes.
Maybe behaving in a way that is not conforming to a static definition of a particular gender. For example, and I think we've become more, this has become more prevalent in our culture to allow people to be on a spectrum in their behavior, not to say you are born with a penis, you behave like a man, and this is what it means, and this is always going to be what it means. Now, there's much more of a fluidness about the behavior of that person born with a penis,
Right.
or without one.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the idea of non-conforming
Mm-hmm.
is behaving in a way different than what people expect someone with that physical body to do or be like.
Nicely put. So I think we all have recognized that there are assumptions that society has made around gender. And gender variant suggests that gender is destable and is non-conforming, right? So this is I like this term, this gender variant term, because it refers to this spectrum that we might, in which we might participate. Can we think a minute about gender nonconforming or gender variance in the Bible? We are in a church, and I want to raise this up, that this is not a new thing. Gender variance has been around as long as creation. What about some examples in the Bible? Can anyone think of any example in the Bible?
I would think Ruth might be, in that she was forward about who she wanted to marry, or who she was making the first move in that relationship.
Okay,
That might be.
okay. Any other Hebrew Bible examples?
I have this second hand out of Rachel Held Evans' book, but apparently Adam, the word Adam in Hebrew just meant human, and for the first, until Adam was split into a male and female, there's nothing in the language that implies that that person was specifically male, and in fact I understand that some of the Jewish tradition says that he was in fact, they were in fact androgynous at creation. It's
Okay.
hard to know much about short
Right, so
answers.
Adam means earth creature in Hebrew. We can't assume a gender for Adam. It is a masculine term in Hebrew, and so we've associated Adam with a body with a penis. What about Jacob and Esau? What were you going to say?
I'd say God has had a pretty rough time on gender
Yeah,
assignment.
I was gonna say, yeah.
Yes, she has.
Yeah, I mean, our language is usually male identified, God is male identified. And you mess with that, suddenly you're either, you're in trouble, not God.
Right?
But the binary is deeply troubling to me when it comes to the gender assignment to God.
So are you suggesting, I just want to make an inference here, are you suggesting that God is transgender?
I'm suggesting that our groping, and I use that intentionally, our groping with and of God is that it should be we should transcend the notions of gender. We wrestle with gender variants of God.
Yeah.
But it's just a deeply troubling thing to
Sure.
me that wherever I go in churches, I have a friend of mine who said, the last time I heard that many he's was in a Lamaze class, and it was because they're so it was that's a primary one for me in terms of understanding gender in text.
I think it's a great statement, and I think there still needs to be work on how we understand God and gender. I mean, there's still work that needs to be done on that. What about some other examples in the Bible? I had in my mind Jacob and Esau. Is anyone familiar with this story? I'm sure we all are. Do you remember it?
Because Jacob stayed at home with mom while Esau was out hunting?
And what did Esau look like?
Was the big hairy one.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And so we might think about Jacob and Esau stabilizing or destabilizing gender identities because Jacob was the soft caring one, not hairy. Esau was the big burly one, right? So these ideas and concepts are out there. I can talk about the eunuch, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Is the eunuch an example of a transgender person? Perhaps.
I don't think he had a choice.
Right. Or even, I think Ruth is a great example in thinking about relationality. Also, the ways in which the Hebrew Bible talks about God as spanning a gender perspective, but then we have stabilized God in a certain gender, right? We have masculinized God, if you will.
And we can also think of the disciples or the followings of Christ. They never mentioned the female followers that were also present.
Right. Right. So what about transgender issues? I want to ask two questions in the last 30 minutes that we have. What does this mean for our reconciling work? How does understanding sexual orientation and gender identities affect our reconciling work? And what are the steps to create a more trans-inclusive church? Right, so let's start with the first one. What does it matter that we talk about sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression in a reconciling movement? When the LGBT movement started, it was really L and G. That it was a lesbian and gay movement. And we sought to create reconciling churches for lesbians and gays. But as the movement has grown, we have attached more letters to the signifier. So now it's no longer L and G, but L and G and B and T. And I for intersex. And A for asexual. What does it mean for our reconciling work to address sexual orientation and gender identity? This is open.
It allows people to be themselves without having to try to come across as something that they're not.
Okay.
I think acknowledging that it makes it much more complicated is very important. Because even going from LB or LG to LGB, and then LGBT, SQR, LCI, BSZ, and when we start expanding the alphabet of who to include, it starts becoming easy to just say, oh, forget it, it's too complicated. And the reason I want to speak to this is just because it's complicated does not mean it's not important. And to say that more positively, just because it's complicated, it still is so important. Because when we say all means all, we want it to mean all.
Right. And we also should say that the L and the G movement has been dominated by white bodies. And that there are LGBTIQ bodies that are non-white, who within their own racialized communities have struggled to live out their gender identity and sexual orientation. I come from a Mexican family, and there were certain expectations of me as a person who was born with a vagina. I did not like those expectations, and I have struggled to sort of re-identify myself with expectations that make more sense to me. And so let's not forget that our reconciling movement is it moves beyond white bodies who might be L and G and B and T, right? What are some other ideas? What is the significance of this for our reconciling movement? I think complicated, it's more complicated than what we think is great.
I think that it helps us to move past it just being a thing about gay marriage too.
Right.
I feel like so many people talk about reconciling churches as the gay marriage churches.
Right.
The ones who are all about gay marriages and gay pastors.
Right.
And instead it's more of exploring who people are and allowing people to be who they are, especially in a place of worship.
Right. And that worship might look different for folks who are trans, right? Or L, G, and B. Other ideas?
I think that we are welcoming toward all is going to be a much more powerful statement than we're welcoming toward 90% of God's children, and stopping anywhere short of all would still rob it of the power. We're welcoming to 98% really isn't that much more beautiful than we're welcoming of 90%. You kind of have to go for everybody, which is why I like what you said, because it kind of turns around, instead of feeling like, well, the burden is on us to explain why this new letter of the alphabet belongs in the church, if the default is to say that the church belongs to everybody, and somebody who wants to keep a letter out has to explain why, I think that's a stronger position for the church to be in.
Other thoughts, ideas?
I think that part of it is that when you don't understand something, you might be scared of it, because you might say the wrong thing, you might offend somebody, but chances are, by just asking questions, you'll be less offensive than ignoring something. I guess I grew up in a church that's always been reconciling, because I'm lucky enough to be young enough where that's the case, and my church was one of the first, but it's easy now for us to say, of course the lesbian couple can come in, or of course the gay couple can come in, but how do I respond if someone who doesn't look like I expect them to look, or doesn't, whatever. I guess it's just, the more you understand, the better chance you have of actually all meaning all.
I want to add something to this topic too, that I'm a parent and my girls are 10 and 13. It's a very binary world for them, and understanding life at their age, it's either this way or that way. And I just want to say that it is also complicated to explain to my children this idea in a way that lays the groundwork for them as their brains develop and their understanding of life and the world develops, that they have a respect for people wherever they are on whatever spectrum.
Right.
And that it's not just a two-dimensional linear spectrum, it is multidimensional.
Wow. Not even 3D, right?
Right, it is more, yes.
At our church, we have a little girl, if it's relevant, but she prefers, she's like 8 or 7, I don't know how old she is, but she's been wearing ties for the past 3 years. And I think just being able to just like embrace that or not think much about it it's an important thing for a church to do, to embrace however she wants to come to church that day. Whether that's her sister wears a big poofy dress every week and she always wears a tie, and she is welcome to do that.
So that's a great segue into the second question. What are the steps in creating a more trans-inclusive church? Reconciling church, hopefully, right?
I want to say, number one, bathrooms that are not gender identified.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, in many ways still challenging, because then where everyone can feel comfortable, or at least having one place where someone who it does not fall into one or the other feels comfortable going.
Right. So I have a practice of going to the closest restroom ever, right? So if the closest restroom is a women's restroom, I'll use that. If the closest restroom is a men's restroom, I'll use that. And I've had experiences where I have been shooed out of the men's restroom. And so this sort of, and I do it just because I want to go to the closest restroom. I have to use the bathroom, right? It's about convenience for me. But creating spaces where folks are comfortable using the restroom is a great place to start. I have a colleague with whom I work. If there are just two options, right? If it's not a gender neutral bathroom, this person will use the men's. If it's a single stall thing, you know, where you walk in and close the door and you're the only person in there, she will use the men's restroom. And it's about disrupting the space and not being okay with there's only these two options. Other ideas? What steps can we take to create a trans inclusive?
Maybe looking at how we celebrate things like Mother's Day, Father's Day, United Methodist Women's Day, United Methodist Men's Day, and what that means to celebrate Mother's Day when we give out flowers, and Father's Day when we give out golf tees.
Right.
Assuming that all men, even just assuming that all men play golf.
Right. Right.
But that sort of thing, looking at how we celebrate people in different ways.
We don't celebrate Mother's Day or Father's Day anymore in our church as per se as Mother's Day, Father's Day. It's we have a celebration of parenthood, and that's.
And are all genders invited to participate?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, because we do have gay couples that do have children, and so you know you're labeling people by saying Mother and Father's Day, and so you can't do that.
Right. Right.
And the kids appreciate, I mean, the kids notice the difference. In those kinds of situations, the kids notice the difference, and because they're still very concrete and either or and trying to figure out where they fit with parents that are of the same gender. I think that's really important.
Or, I mean, there are lots of different ways to be a parent too, right?
Mhm.
And so trans folks might be parents to friends, right? And so expanding our idea of what parent is, even parenthood. Other ideas on steps that we can take to create a trans inclusive community? I think starting with how we talk about God might be a step. And even the communion liturgy, right?
I think using a plumb line in church programming, using a plumb line with how would a trans person participate in this program might help identify how a program is gender biased or role biased versus getting down to talking about what we all wrestle with, judgment management and grace management. I want to say who God's graceful to. Therefore I want to bestow judgment. That's the wrestling I want to have with my peers in faith. So having a plumb line, raising that question in any church programming can help identify those glitches of how are we supporting a particular framing of family, of gender, versus are we getting to our theological wrestlings that we really want to get to.
Well, let me also say that the question of how can or how does a trans person participate in this community, we also need to modify that to include, because a trans person, we might assume that trans person is white, but what if the trans person is of color? That will change, I think, how we think about this, right? So how a black trans person.
I don't understand why.
Well, because I think when we talk about this, race and sexuality, that black communities they do church differently than other communities, right? Latino communities do church differently than other communities, and so when we talk about a Latino or a Latina as a trans person in a faith community, in helping to create a trans inclusive space, community, church space for a Latino or a Latina who is trans, we might come up with a different answer to that. My point is when we interrogate gender identity and sexual orientation in the same conversation as race, it might further disrupt our assumptions and expectations around gender and sexuality.
Okay, I guess I come from a very small city that has like 13,000 people in it. Then upstate New York, that we've been a reconciling church for 25 years, and I think and we're all inclusive in our language, so I don't think maybe some of these things that I have actually come across, because we are such a gender included, everything included church, that and we do have restrictions on population that we have in our area. So maybe that's why I'm not understanding the different race. I don't want to sound like I'm not trying to be exclusive, but it's just that what I have been exposed to.
Right, sure. What were you going to say?
I was thinking, this is the sort of case where Robyn is better at answering that than me, obviously, but that brings up the notion that if you can find somebody in the community that you're interested in reaching out to, and go to them and invite them, could you kind of like give our church a trans health audit, or even a trans person of color, could you come and take a look from your own eyes instead of me trying to guess what you are seeing with your own eyes, which not only might be the most accurate way to get an idea of how they see things, it might be a sneaky way to try to get them inside the church too.
Yeah, you know, I think, and I think I said this several minutes ago, the reconciling movement started as a white movement, right? LNG. And when we want to talk about reconciling, we need to broaden it beyond white communities, and we need to start thinking about what are our Latino and Latina brothers and sisters, how do they participate in a reconciling community, how do Black trans folks participate in our communities, and I mean, I hear what you're saying, right? Like it's I can talk from my own personal experience. Growing up, I attended a Catholic school where I was the only Mexican. It was dominated by white bodies.
Yeah, well, I'm about the only Indian too, so, you know, I can understand that, but I'm sitting here saying, what difference does it make? People are people, and yet, because I really don't understand the difference.
I think the difference it makes is because color disrupts space, and people of color might have a different experience than other bodies. What were you going to say?
I was gonna say that I think it has more to do with privilege.
Okay.
And a lot of it has to do with privilege and just historically thinking about race. White people have had more privilege over others, and so when you look at it that way, you have to think about not knowing that you have privilege or that you have a history of privilege and accepting that and using that to be an ally for someone who probably hasn't had that experience of privilege.
And do I hear you saying that people with privilege create a certain type of space that might not be inclusive for other people?
No, I think that people with privilege who don't recognize their privilege create a space that is different for others.
Okay.
So if you know, I'm going to use it as like I have the privilege of not, you know, being in a wheelchair.
Right.
And so if I don't recognize that privilege and I'm like walking up the stairs of church or something, like I'm not knowing that, well, maybe we should put in a ramp because I have the privilege of not being in a wheelchair and someone else doesn't.
That's great.
So that's
Yeah. What I hear in this is the positivity of difference. If we can start at a place of the positivity of difference, right? So whether it is a person who recognizes the privilege of not being in a wheelchair or skin color, that if we can claim difference as a fundamental starting place in our work together in a reconciling movement, we might get somewhere. So this, I think, anchorage, I'm going to go back to that. It was a great term that you mentioned in the beginning. If we can anchor ourselves in, not the binary, but in difference, and affirm difference, multiplicity and difference as a fundamental starting place in our reconciling movement might look different, and we might be able to create a trans-inclusive community. Any questions? I want to be conscious of our time. We have 9 minutes.
You were going to talk about Two-Spirit?
Two-Spirit. Well, my understanding is Two-Spirit folks are Native American or American Indian folks who would affirm both a male and female spirit. And this plays out differently in different Native American, American Indian communities. They might have multiple partners. Their gender identity and gender expression might play out outside the norm that we might associate with male and female. We might call Two-Spirit folks gender variant. Would you like to add anything to that?
Well, just that the Indian American community pretty much before the introduction of white man. Here was Indian Americans that were Two-Spirit, were very well accepted into the tribe, and they were respected. They were usually considered holy, sacred people. And, you know, so it's a whole different outlook until the Europeans came here and
Right.
decided to change everything for them.
Any questions? Any other questions? Any clarifications? Yes.
So, when we were talking about cisgender, the way I've been told that cisgender is it's more with gender, so not so much with sexual orientation. So, I could be cisgender but still be lesbian or
Right.
bisexual
Right.
or what. Is that
So is
how the term is used, or was I
No, that,
misinformed?
did I say something different?
No.
Because I would agree with you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's like if somebody, say, it's a girl, I decided, or I wanted to be more of a tomboy and do all the things that guys did, but yet identified with the female, is that what you're saying? Something like that?
Yes.
Okay.
That would be cisgender.
Okay. That was me.
Any other questions or clarifications?
Do you have any suggestions on how you would speak to youth or children just to be supportive or make it more clear that you don't have those definitions? Like, are there any suggestions when working with youth or the children? I work closely with our youth group in our
Yeah.
confirmation class. So any things, we've talked about how to speak about God, and we talked about is God male or female, and they immediately were like, well, both. Like that was
Yeah.
the obvious thing.
So you-
Of course that makes sense.
I mean, but even that question assumes a binary, right? It assumes
that
an either
was-
or position,
That was
right?
the conversation that we were having was, I mean, the church, we talk about male or female, but what if God is, in this passage, God's a tree? Or in this passage, God's male, or in this passage, God's a father, and this one a mother, and then we talked about imagery that you might associate, so it wasn't even a person sometimes, but I don't know if you have other suggestions of how to kind of bring up those conversations without being too much, I don't know.
I mean, as a general starting point, I would love to begin socializing young people into transcending the binary. So not even using an either or position, but starting beyond that, right? So asking open-ended questions, and then for example, what is God? And if the youth says God is X, then you might try to ask another open-ended question to move beyond a stabilizing. I mean, the problem is our language. We're so formed by language, right? And if there is a way that we can undo some of this, unanchor the ways in which we've been socialized by language to create more possibilities. I mean, I think of Virginia Ramey Mollencott's book, Omnigender. You know, it was a great starting point. You know, in the end, some people might say that it stabilizes gender, but if we can begin to look at things in more of a spectrum, right? So, what is God? God might revolve around the spectrum of being, if you will, right? It might not include gender, right? Does that help?
Mostly I just really love that you're thinking about this. Something that comes to mind is when you're trying to praise a little kid. If you see people trying to say, they'll probably say to the little girl, "Oh, your dress is so pretty," and they might say to the little boy, "Hey, there's Slugger, put her there," and you know, look for more creative ways to praise a child and interact with them, which is good for every kind of child. Teach them that it's more than that girls are valued for being pretty and boys are valued for being strong. Those are really dumb reasons to value somebody anyway.
Eric.
Yes.
So one of the things I look at is a lot of our churches will have safe sanctuaries policies for protection of children and youth and older adults and all sorts of things. and they're very heteronormative in their language of men stay with men, women stay with women. You don't want people of cross genders sort of things. But how do I know obviously this will make it more complicated to draft a legal policy based on a language that's distorted. But do you have any resources that would help churches who are trying to be more open and inclusive in their child safety policies, or know of someone who may be a resource to help churches as they try to become more?
Rachel, can I enlist you with that question?
I think related to having more gender inclusive policies, I think CASRU is a great resource.
Mhm.
So that's the commission
On the General Commission on the Status and Role of Women.
So I think that they're a great resource.
Okay.
It's a United Methodist denominational resource. Is based here in Chicago. Former RMN staff now works there, so they're a really great place, I think, to connect around church policy language.
I'm wondering, and I don't know if the Metropolitan Community Church that has some experience in more sexual identity variants,
Yeah.
if their policies might be helpful in
Better
that.
language.
There's, because they were some of the early people early denominations who did have a consciousness about gender balance and that you can't assume male to male is necessarily a safe arena.
Mhm.
So that might be, and they traditionally put up some things online that were helpful.
Is that helpful?
That is
Great. I think we're almost out of time. We may have like 2 minutes left. Let me just check. But we can, so we have 1 minute left, which means that we have a half a question time. Does anybody have a half question?
I think I'm always challenged by how to listen. To listening, because my filters can be so well seasoned by binary modes and roles, and so how to just shut up and listen, and the freedom to ask, what do you want me to know? And those are new conversations, I think, in most of our churches, to have the comfort of inviting people in my own invitation to share who I am and how I want to be known, and just the hard job of listening.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming and being present in what sometimes can be a very challenging conversation. But I hope that you leave with a few things that beckon you, and that you'll continue to explore trans-related issues. Enjoy the rest of Winter Morgan.